Reactive training systems.
Keep the beginning parts pretty casual. You know, like a lot of podcasts you do, they're like, starting now, introduce yourself. Da, 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 da. And I don't know, I always skip that part anyway. So.
No, it's always more interesting when you feel like you've just walked in on a conversation rather than, you know, some sort of production or whatever.
That's how I feel about it. But,
yeah. How's the family doing?
Good. We're, I guess it's getting close to springtime because nobody's been sick in a few weeks. I don't know. We've got my oldest is 8, and then with the twins running around, they're still 2. So usually somebody is sick, but that hasn't been the case lately. So that's nice.
Knock on wood.
Right.
That way.
What are you saying? What are you saying?
I know, like with because I coach Brad Couliard, and I feel like, you know, every productive string of training that we have just always has to get derailed by the girls brought something home from school. I've been in bed. I've been sick, and I'm like, just once. Let's finish a training period to some sort of conclusion where we could be like, yes, we got out of it what we needed.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. You know, honestly, when I first started doing the emerging strategy stuff, that was one of the things I discovered about myself is I didn't have any problem at all getting productive training in. It's just that to build on my total would require doing that consistently. And I just seemed incapable of putting it together on a consistent basis. Like I could get a block or 2, but then I'd be traveling, or then I'd have something come up and I'd need to take like this extended pivot time frame or something like that. And then you start a new development block that's productive, but you're just starting from this like really regressed space. And so you got to spend this block making up lost ground. And, you know, it would just, I'm like, oh, I see the problem. The problem isn't like you get to the point where you can no longer like build more strength. It's that, at least in my case, it's like life complicates to the point where I can't, or I couldn't put strings of training together to see like real progress over a year, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I guess, you know, the name of the game with emerging strategies is that time or the turnover for the number of exposures. So if that's the system that you're following, it's like, there's no way to get around it, right? Like you can't, if you're following a different model, I guess you could force certain windows of training and, you know, try to, you know, write things in a way that maybe is, you know, providing more high intensity exposures or something to try to get some type of, you know, sign that you are going in the right direction. But I guess if it's just number of iterations, there's no way around that.
I suppose I could have done more on like pushing higher frequencies and things like that, because that should shorten your block time. But still, like if you're traveling once a month and you happen to find that derailing in a significant way, that's a lot. You know, it's a lot to overcome. But I don't know. Things have been better on that front lately. I seem to be better able to make adjustments around that. So anyway, that's the silver lining in my own story.
Good, man. Do you have any travel coming up anytime soon, or are you
Malta? I think is the next one for me. I'm just going to coach, so I'll be part of the early morning training crews there. They go hit up the warm up room before everybody gets going.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's a good time though. What about you? What's coming up for you?
So we have Collegiate Nationals next week. So I'm going to be there Thursday through Sunday because I have someone who's a 48 kilo female, and then I have, you know, a 110 kilo male the last day. So I'm there the whole time. But it's in Arlington, and, you know, I have friends in Dallas who I can train with while I'm there. So it'll be a good time, you know, even in the lull periods. And then actually what I'm really excited for is end of April going to Hawaii because one of the coaches who works for me, Jaron, owns a gym out in Hawaii. He's hosting a meet that I'll be emceeing and sponsoring the meet. And then the following week, we're doing a seminar at his gym. So it'll be a fun 2 weeks.
It'll be fantastic. Sure. I saw some of some of the shirts that you guys are making and stuff like that. I thought you had something coming up in Hawaii. But, yeah.
Yep. Have
No,
you
I've
been or
never
no?
been. I would love to go.
Yeah, neither
I
have
would
I.
love to go. But yeah, so like as far as collegiates goes, do you coach like you hear about some people that are just coaching like a ton of people, right? Like I'm there from session 1 morning weigh-ins till closing time at night every day because they're coaching I don't know how many people. But are you doing that, or do you try to
Yeah.
space it out? You got people helping?
No, it's pretty dispersed. I don't think I'll need help this year. I have 7 lifters competing, but it seems to be that they're all kind of spread out really nicely. That first day I only have 1, but then following that, I think Saturday is going to be my busiest day. But in previous years, I've definitely had it worse. Like I remember the Collegiate Nationals in 2019 that John Downing hosted in Columbus. In total, I had like I think 14 or 15 lifters doing it, but it was a 5 platform meet, and one session I had 4 people all on different platforms, all in the same session. So it was just madness running from platform to platform, where I did need help with that for sure. But with the layout, I guess, that they're doing this year, where like a lot of people kind of got, the short end of the stick with being able to sign up, because they were prioritizing the teams first, and they had a roster cap and all that. There were probably like a good 4 or 5 lifters that would have done it that just ended up not being able to. So yeah, it'll be a fun week, but not anything overwhelming by any means.
That's good.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick your brain on some training stuff, if that's cool.
Yeah.
I had a few things
course,
I
man.
wrote down here, but I think maybe to jump off, maybe a good place to start would be kind of the end of our conversation last time, which was on the Powerlifting Now chat that we had. Something that you said was that you felt like time to, at least this was my interpretation of it, was that you felt like time to peak as a concept was maybe more robust than I had given it credit for, like more robust to changes in a microcycle. So maybe I should set the stage a little bit more. So our conversation was about like static microcycle designs, which is more like the classic emerging strategies approach, versus something that is more typical from like what maybe you and Steve and Marcellus and Matt would all program more typically, and kind of one of the things that I think I heard you say was that you can find something like time to peak, and it can be robust to some changes from microcycle to microcycle. Like if you're ramping up the RPE a bit from one to the next, that's not going to completely throw off time to peak. Am I kind of getting that more or less right?
Yeah, I think so. I would say that the thing that I have found, and just to, for everyone listening, obviously, if they've listened to you,
I start in right.
They're very familiar with emerging strategy. I
just start in like assuming everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe that's not the best idea.
No, but I'm sure this audience is pretty. No, I would bet that this audience is really familiar, and that's been a huge, inspiration for my own programming design, because, my first exposure to powerlifting programming design was from a strength and conditioning coach I had growing up, which was like very, conjugate based and linear periodization, and just like what I would say most people get their first exposures to. And then, I had worked with Joey Flex for about 4.5, 5 years, and that was a big point of exposure. But early on in my time working with him, I had gotten into coaching myself, and, drew a lot of inspiration from you. And, one of the things that I've found through just coaching my own population of athletes is that, with emerging strategies kind of mandating some sort of static microcycle layout by way of, the actual schedule of things, as well as the programmed RPs or exertions. One of the things that I've found to kind of, I guess, expand upon it in my own practice is like, different people definitely have different sensitivities, whether that's to pushing, absolute intensities, whether that's to pushing, just above some sort of subjective exertion. So bar velocity, I guess, would be the really quantifiable way to define that. And then like certain rep ranges, right? But I've definitely had the experience where certain lifters, we can have predictable training durations with a set microcycle structure by way of exercise selection, rep sets, and all that, but alter the pacing in a way that allows them to, unveil their highest level performance. And I'm not here to say that, every lifter that I've ever worked with has been able to demonstrate like a perfect, adherence to this time to peak layout, right? Where like, for example, if I have an kind of an odd number of weeks going into a competition and we're in a weird spot where something like that couldn't be timed up perfectly, the, I guess, modification that I would adhere to is the principle, I guess, of like pacing the block in a way that has been demonstrated to be appropriate for this lifter. And I think we talked about this on the Powerlifting Now podcast, where like, you can observe the best possible training outcomes with certain athletes who will really abide by a very static layout in terms of prescribed intensities, and they'll be able to adapt and in a certain period of time showcase their highest level strength. I have one lifter, this kid Sam, who comes to mind, where not only is that doable or feasible for him, but without starting at a very high baseline of intensity, he just kind of fizzles out. Like he will not respond. So there's a certain amount of intensity that's kind of required for him to perform well. But in other circumstances, there are lifters where I certainly see that while if the goal of programming is to find the time to peak, then we can probably get that for almost every lifter, right? But I think the primary goal, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, is for someone to actually, get stronger, right? So it's like, I do absolutely agree that for any given lifter, we could find a microcycle structure where if we run that for X number of iterations, we will find this time to peak. However, based on certain sensitivities to absolute intensities or exertions or what have you, will that actually yield the best possible training outcome for this person? And that's kind of the question that I've asked myself. And I don't think the answer is always yes. So the thing that I've put into practice now is essentially, whenever I start with a lifter, because maybe if people are listening to this who haven't heard the Powerlifting Now podcast, when I go through the process of starting with a lifter and taking in whatever data it is that is necessary, either their old historical, their historical training data, and then kind of using comparisons that I have on my own roster, or drawing upon some sort of heuristics or comparisons I have for an athlete like this one. I will go about writing this microcycle that I think, number of exposures to a certain intensity is appropriate. The rep ranges are appropriate, just like the baseline starting RPEs are appropriate for whatever sensitivities this lifter has or has not shown. And I will take a very emerging strategies-esque approach in the sense that I'm not going to change prescribed exertions if adaptations are occurring. So maybe the first 3 weeks, let's say, do look like just a pure emerging strategies layout, in the sense that, hey, if you're adding more weight to the bar and this is the layout and I'm not adding sets and I'm not changing the rep ranges, then, we have this favorable outcome, right? But with that, like I kind of said in the beginning, I don't necessarily start at higher RPEs. So in order to eventually get there has to be some sort of progression up to that. And what I try to do is, in that bottoms up fashion, find the appropriate pace for actually pushing towards some sort of conclusion. And I've found that is a kind of a robust quality within athletes, in that, like, not only how long would it take to peak following the same thing, but kind of how much tolerance do I have for like a gradient in intensity, maybe would be a way to word it. And like, what exactly is that for someone to, while following a structure that we deem to be sound, eventually reach some sort of conclusion.
Yeah. And like, yeah, you
so
mean
does
like
that,
a conclusion,
that
like
kind of
in the last week, you're handling something heavier, probably at a higher RPE, something like that.
Yeah, something specific, right? So ideally at a higher RPE, lower bar velocity, that would indicate to both of us that what we have been doing is successful, right? And the way that we obviously measure that is, compared to whatever baseline we had, did we actually improve? And are there indicators that are, estimated 1 rep max is improved? Are we on the right track? Yeah. And I'm sure you would agree that if you were just sticking to lower RPEs, could you be hitting, rep PRs? Sure, great. But like, are we actually getting better at the top end? We don't really know until we get that exposure.
I probably phrased that question kind of badly. It definitely didn't mean it in any sort of confrontational kind of way. It definitely meant to find out kind of what you're up to. And
I didn't perceive it that way.
Just always like to make sure. Yeah, I have kind of broadened some of my own thoughts on this too. And I guess over the years, I think I'm maybe mentioned in our last conversation that John has been a big influence on me with some of this stuff, because he would talk about using intro weeks, which are not part of the emerging strategies that I've taught, right? But it's just like, hey, in week 1, let's maybe take out a couple of the down sets, and maybe let's drop the RPEs by half or 1, just to make the transition a little bit easier. So it does kind of create a little bit of a gradient, a little bit of a ramping up thing. And I mean, if you're thinking that most people are going to land in block lengths at like 5-ish, give or take, then that does kind of ramp things up. And if you're willing to let athletes send it a little bit on the last week, which I happen to think is a good idea, maybe we programmed single at 8, but if we get into the last week of the block, we know it's the last week, and you're feeling good, like you ought to, then yeah, if you want to go for it, then go for it. But that's the best time to go for it, I think. But I suppose it.
Yeah, I think there's kind of like,
I was just gonna say, I suppose it could be like written down, that there's a certain quality of it, having it written down, that I could see being beneficial. Yeah. If you're kind of feeling it, then go for it. I think that's something that gets missed a lot. And this has come up more and more for me lately when I've talked to people about kind of what is it about the training that moves us forward. I think there needs to be some aspect of it that is a reach, that's pushing for, more than you've ever done, whether it's pushing for a volume PR or something like that. Like I know Jason talks about attack weeks and stuff like that, which I think is a different instantiation of that concept. Bondarchuk talked about like the peak condition, so they're both kind of landing on something similar, like this heightened performance, a high stress week, a high stimulus week that comes like right before the deload. I mean, that's not rare in like periodization concepts. I could see the appeal of like having that kind of written into the structure of the program too.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of an unwritten rule or practice from athletes sometimes, where that's kind of the intent. They see the end of the block and it says RP 8.5 to 9, and to them that means, all right, I'm just going to do something I've never done before. But I think something interesting that I've seen is like, I don't personally do this because I really like for people to just lean into their own natural temperament, whatever that might be. But I've seen people like indicate some sort of differentiation and arousal level
Yeah.
within program to be like, hey, get really hyped for this or do that. And I can see how that could, kind of allow you to get the most out of that conclusion of the training period. But something that I've kind of started to do in communicating with my athletes is, and I'm sure you would agree with this as well, where like, you can be going through some sort of training period and recognize from the coach end, like, all right, we have not really like, we're not yet in our stride. We have not yet caught the most momentum, and people will get to the conclusion of their training block and they'll want to like send it. Right. And I'll make the point like, hey, we're pretty much going to roll right into a refined iteration of what we've been doing this whole time. So I don't want you to think that like this is the end where you have to prove yourself. In fact, I think you might do more harm than good to do that now, because we're trying to now kind of restart the same progression that we've been doing. Like, please just adhere strictly. Let's roll into the next one where I do suspect there will be that moment to strike while the iron's hot. And then when we perceive there to actually be this high, then we can push it to some sort of, high arousal, higher exertion conclusion, because after that, we know that it's, there's a deloader, there's a reset or a pivot.
Yeah.
Right?
But, I've got a friend of mine who talks about this. If you think of the training program as being like instructions, they're honestly fairly vague instructions. There's a whole bunch of stuff that athletes do, make decisions on, and just all the stuff that's not written down. I think you can chalk a lot of that up to training intelligence, but the context that you're in is really important, like exactly what you're describing. If you're going to roll into another block, or you're getting close to a competition or something like that, may not be the time for stupid human tricks. But yeah, other times that's totally appropriate. So yeah, I mean, it does come back to needing some sort of communication between athlete and coach, some sort of shared understanding about where you're at and where you're headed. And it can't all get written down into the program. I saw the Bryce Lewis's April Fool's post was kind of a post to this effect. Like, it was obviously a joke, but it was like, we're going to program everything, like down to what should you be thinking about before the set, like how many breaths should you take before you walk out, like, I mean, just everything,
What
right?
music?
What music should you listen to? Which is, I mean, that's what makes it funny, right? It's because it's so obviously over the top. But I do see people actually going in that direction, that what seems to me like an overprescription of training. Like I don't even get too much into the warm-ups that we're doing, unless there's a specific problem to be solved. Like, you've got persistent hip pain, and it's like, okay, let's get into this and see if we can figure out a better way. But if things are normal, then just warm up, whatever, whatever feels good. Well, how many reps should I do with the bar? Like, I'm not telling you that, as many as it takes to feel good, feel normal, and then move on to the next one. That I think there's an intuition that's worth developing around that. Do you see that as is there a trend here that people tend to overprescribe things, or some people can tend toward overprescribing?
I definitely see it. And I think that it's one, a lot of there certainly are a lot of people who coach who are very data oriented, and they also want to have high predictability, as we all do. But with that comes this feeling of needing to control every single variable. Like, I know a lot of coaches who are, that I've spoken to, just people who are kind of up and coming coaches who I had one at the gym one time show me like his spreadsheet, and he's like, oh, like, look, I track this, I track this, I track this, I track this. And I'm like, that's great. Like you're obviously very smart. You're thinking about all this stuff, but at the same time, it's like you said, there is a level of intuition that an athlete needs to develop. Obviously also on the coaching side of things, right? Like you could be, missing the forest for the trees by doing that. But I think what's really interesting is kind of the self-organization that lifters, embody in a way that lends itself to better training results. I haven't been doing them lately because I've just been too busy, but I've been doing I do mentorships for coaches, and I had one person that I was doing for like a year, doing it with for like a year straight. And we were talking about, just like when are we prescribing RPs, percentage backdowns, RP caps? Like how do we know when to do what? And an example that I brought up that I thought was just kind of interesting along the lines of like self-organization in terms of creating the best training outcome was, we were talking about Joey and his prescription of pretty much exclusively using RPEs, and how someone like Russell, who obviously has been, very successful in powerlifting, super strong. You'll look at his, I don't know if you've ever watched his YouTube channel, but you'll go see him take a top single on squats, let's say, or a top set of 5. And then it'll be like, okay, I have my back downs now. And he'll drop to like, 485 pounds, let's say. And it's prescribed as a 3x7 at RP7. Now, Russ could probably do that for 20 reps. Is that really an RP7? No, but through his own, and again, this is like, there's no like real quantifiable reason or step-by-step process that like Russ is taking in that moment to say, oh yeah, I'm going to take 485. It's just like, oh, this is a weight that like feels sufficiently challenging, feels like a good weight. And from the perspective of like a very data-oriented coach, you'd be like, this is a very imprecise weight selection. This doesn't even come close to matching the RPE. But I think that there's something to be said about the fact that because he's self-organized in that way, and maybe is performing a certain number of sets a week on squat that are sufficiently below whatever this RP prescription is, and are like low exertion, perhaps over the course of time, that's lend itself to better performances on the top end, better strength progression. And who knows, maybe had he been adhering to an RP percentage chart that did pinpoint, the set of 7s at RP7 at 545 pounds, 555 pounds, if he had selected those weights, would the training outcome be better? Would it be worse? I kind of find it interesting how sometimes based on like athlete temperament, athlete intuition, they kind of organize to what I can believe to be the best possible training scenario. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think there's kind of in ideal circumstances, there's kind of a give and take that happens there too, because the coach is learning and adapting as you go, and if, you say that this is a 7 RPE, there's kind of 2 ways to go about it. One is to kind of put your foot down and say, that's not what I wrote down. Another way is to just adjust, that you say, okay, you think you call that a 7, moving on. If I want you to go heavier than that, then I'll prescribe something heavier. If I want you to go lighter than that, I'll prescribe something lighter. And, just kind of, I think that's contextual too. Like there's a time and place to put your foot down. There's a time and place to just move on to more important topics of conversation. But the system itself can learn and find kind of the local optimum for that set of conditions too, which I think I have to expect is something that happens, especially in cases like that where you've got a talented athlete. Because otherwise we look at it and go, oh, that person could be so much better if they would just, do the better program. And I can't imagine that it would be so much better. Maybe a bit better. I'm definitely one of these people who thinks that like better programming is a thing, that it does matter and, makes a difference. But is it gonna take, is it going to take somebody from squatting 700 pounds, at like the limit of their ability to squatting 800 pounds? I don't know about that. That seems like a big shift, like to make like some minuscule change and then just, oh, it's just so much better this way, you know. But I mean, if you're going to be training, you may as well do the best training that you can find. I mean, you're in here anyway. You may as well do the best that you can figure out.
Yeah, that's always. What has your experience been with this? Because I'm curious with because like what when you think about that question of like what is the best training that you could be doing, right? And obviously we never really know the answer to that, right? Like a lot of times we're just looking at like forward progress and athlete confidence probably as like the two main things that I could attribute to like the best possible program, right? It's like we're doing better than we did last time and the athlete feels good about it. Like you get those two things, you're probably set for the long term. How many times have you found yourself, I guess, because I know I have in the past, just getting greedy and thinking like, oh, we can be even better than that. And you maybe make a change into, higher specificity than what you're doing, even though that what you're doing is yielding forward progress, or maybe you do get, more aggressive with volume. And it's a pretty mixed bag in my experience. Like I've definitely, had certain athletes take steps backwards because we're trying to squeeze out even more than what we were getting. And sometimes it pays off, but it's definitely not an overwhelmingly positive experience.
I mean, my tendency is to do that all the time. Like I'm always like, can we find a better mousetrap? That's my tendency. So over time, I've had to put up some guardrails for myself to keep from making what are like preventably dumb decisions. So like in the case of volume, right, I definitely look at like acute to chronic work ratio and try to have an understanding of where are we at. So if I think for a particular athlete, we should try a training block with more volume, that I can look at this acute to chronic number and that gives me kind of a range. Okay, we can do more volume than we're currently doing, but only up to this certain amount. Otherwise, we're taking some risks that don't need to be taken. And starting to look at that through this, it's one of these fractal things that the more you look at it, the more it subdivides. I look at things in terms of what I call a stress index, which is essentially kind of a counting of hard sets, but easy sets aren't exactly zero, so it tries to quantify the stimulus, the recovery demand of a given training intervention. So I end up looking at it through that lens a lot. But then there's different kinds of training stress, and then depending on what exercises you're doing, that training stress is going to land on different tissues a little bit differently, so the more you look at it, the more it subdivides, and it can be as complicated as you want it to be. I think there's a benefit to bringing an appreciable level of complexity to programming. Like I feel like that's my job, like I look at it that way, and then hopefully we can distill it down to something pretty simple and the athlete doesn't have to get that far into the weeds. But yeah, I've needed some guardrails to make sure I'm not doing silly things. But even then, like I'm doing this block right now with weight releasers because it's one of these things that should work, right? Like on paper, it seems like it should work. Now I've tried weight releasers for my bench in particular over the years, and it just never has. And somewhere before this block started, I was thinking, I thought, anytime I've ever tried weight releasers, it's been on like one exercise a week, and you're only getting them for that first rep. So I might get like 5 reps a week with the weight releasers. It just seems like a really low stimulus. What if maybe it's just like too low of a dose? Maybe it needs to be a greater volume of weight releaser work, So in this block, I've put them on just about everything I can put them on. And it occurred to me somewhere around week 3, I'm like, this is a lot, like if there's some inherent risk to doing a lot of weight releaser work, I am fully launching myself into that risk. So far so good, but it was a thing that bore a little bit of extra consideration at this point.
I had a question for you regarding the stress index. I hope I can word this correctly. How do you interpret it if there's, I guess, disparity between, I guess, the net positive or net negative effects of sets that go into that count? So like if you're someone who responds really well to high stress sets, and that is the bulk of what gives you a good training response, then the positive outcome of doing those sets is high, but then the stress index is also high if you're following that. But then on the flip side of that, if you have an athlete who responds really poorly to higher stress sets and then they respond better to sets that I guess would count less, how do you go about, I guess, from athlete to athlete interpreting that value? If the number of sets that yield positive versus negative factor into that differently, I guess. I hope I worded that correctly.
I think of stress index as kind of the quantity. It's a volume measurement, so it's like the quantity of training that we're doing, and so that'll be mostly limited by recovery. So if you have somebody that's a high responder to either high RPEs or low RPEs, we'll program that, but then stress index more attempts to answer how many sets are we going to do with that. So like we'll set the rep and the RPE pairing kind of separately from that. You almost do that first. So I know what intensities we're going to work at, and that'll yield like a rep and RPE pairing. So we're going to do like our back off work is going to be set to 5 at a 7 RPE. Okay, well, how many sets are we going to do? Well, that'll be determined by like the stress index. How much stress do we want to impart into this slot? Well, we want it to be a 2.5 stress. So that's going to be however many sets it's going to work out to be, 4 sets or whatever. So that's kind of, it's more that approach. It's more agnostic on athlete response. And it's more like a volume measurement. Okay. It just tries to get around the fact that like if you do tonnage, that really biases you toward low intensity, high rep work, but then if you count number of sets, you get around a lot of that stuff, but it's just such a low resolution metric, so stress index tries to be something similar to number of sets, but a little bit higher resolution,
Okay. So I'm understanding it better now. I guess I thought it was being used also as like a marker of fatigue within the program, not just as a prescription factor. Is it being used that way, or
not that I'm thinking of it anyway? Like we do kind of some separate tracking of fatigue and fatigue markers, but that's more like subjective questionnaire stuff. We're asking about soreness and things like that. I had a question I wanted to ask you. No, and I really have no idea where this might take us. So whatever you think is fine. There's a phrase that I've heard tossed around a little bit. I'll just kind of put it out there and get your take on it. Powerlifting is basically sports-specific bodybuilding plus technique work. Is that something that, I don't know, what is your reaction to that?
I mean, I think that because I've heard that quote, several years back during what I would deem to be like the transitional era of what powerlifting programming was, from, very low rep, high intensity, or just like, low rep technique work, to then kind of treating it in a way that you would periodize bodybuilding work, and, working in a whole array of rep ranges. So I think that I guess the problem that it was seeking to address is, I think it was like I think it's a right correction of what it used to be. Because in all honesty, right, like all of the best power lifters within any given weight class, especially the lower ones, usually are, the most muscular within that weight class. They've kind of maxed out the amount of lean tissue they can have on their frame. So I don't know that I would necessarily really disagree with it. I guess I'd be curious to hear your critique of it, because it does sound like in bringing it up, you have some sort of counter point to that claim. So I'm curious at the lens you're looking at it through, so I can maybe give my thoughts.
I don't know. Maybe to me, it just seems a bit limited. And I didn't know that about the prior context. Maybe I just hadn't encountered it until somewhat more recently. But I think generally I see where it's coming from, but I do think that there's like other adaptations that are worth caring about. I think one of the things that seems to be missing for me is some of the low rep training, but not quite singles. Like if I took that seriously, which it probably isn't meant to be taken this seriously, but if you did, you would say, okay, like the technique work, once you've reached a decent level of proficiency, is going to be mostly singles, a range of different intensities, but somewhat significant intensities, and it'll get into quite high intensities as you progress. The rest of the training would tend to be oriented more toward bodybuilding work. And I think that misses a lot of value that you do get from kind of this intermediate rep range, intermediate intensity zone. Just that it's there is value there. I guess that's the main thing, that there's value in training around 85% and doing like some low rep sets at 85% and stuff like that, which I don't think is taboo to say or anything. It's like things haven't shifted that far, but I suppose that's where I'm coming at it.
No, I agree with you, and that's I agree with your point about it being limited, and I think that's why we've we talked about on like the Powerlifting Now podcast how there are like just different response types to different intensity zones and consequently rep ranges. There are some lifters that I have who will absolutely be their strongest, never having to touch like hypertrophy rep ranges on any of the big three movements. What I guess that might be a point of maybe confusion in that quote for some people is the technique work part, because I think people will inherently assume that like technique work means that it's light or that it's like negligible intensity. So for me, I guess the way that I would define that second part of the phrase in technique work would be anything that is challenging the technique to be done correctly, which can be very heavy.
Oh, I'm totally with you there. I think that's something
and probably has to be.
I think that's something that people get wrong a lot. That I was just having a conversation with a lifter, and he was telling me that like local to him, there's a lot of kind of programming very, very light stuff, like 50% work, like sub 70% work, and that the intent is to be done for technique. And I feel like, man, once you've developed a basic proficiency for technique, like that's not really doing anything for you anymore. You've got to challenge technique in order to see improvements in technique.
Yeah, so that I think would be the main difference between maybe how people interpret it and maybe how you and I would interpret it, is that in order to challenge technique, it needs to be specific to whatever intensity range would break down your technique, which isn't going to be 70%. So if that's being encompassed or that's how you're defining it, I feel like that's a more complete version of the quote. But I guess along the concept of the submax stuff, you know, and just like programming really light stuff, I guess the way that, because I know, you know, Marcellus had brought this up on the podcast about, you know, programming a lot of stuff pretty light for some lifters, and usually that tends to be a more commonly employed strategy amongst lifters who are like really, really strong. I guess the way that I've kind of thought about it is like, I don't know if you've ever heard that, I don't know what the technical term would be for, but it's like that story about how there's like a professor who has a jar and he's like, oh, if I fill it all up with, yeah. So it's like, I guess the way that I think about it, you know, with programming stuff like that is, you know, per rep, you know, your stimulus is obviously very low in you know, in performing, I don't know, a set of 5 with 67% or something like that. But if you can accumulate more reps with that, the, you know, stimulus or the amount of fatigue being extracted per rep is lower, and maybe you can fill your bucket up with more of those like low risk, low reward, you know, reps and mitigate fatigue that way.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I think there's, you know, that's definitely a valid approach, and that's going to be an ideal approach for, you know, some set of people. There's probably a limit, I would think. There's got to be a limit somewhere, right? Like nobody's squatting a world record for like just training with the bar, you know, so the limit does exist, but it's just kind of, it's a broader range than we maybe would like it to be. If it was like this very narrow, tight thing, you just kind of start there and do the ideal thing, and it's just not that simple.
Yeah, I guess the main thing that I'm thinking with this is like, I think a lot of the really, like if you look at most of what I would say the top, you know, drug tested power lifters, I would probably argue that at some point there was kind of a, you know, well, at one point in powerlifting program, there was a pretty big delineation between like what qualities or skills you would train at different points of the year.
Yeah.
And you would very heavily focus on low load, high rep training for one period. And then you would focus on, you know, low rep, high load training. And eventually we got to the point of it kind of people recognizing that it could be concurrent and you would train multiple qualities at the same time. And I feel like a big part of why so many newer top lifters have been able to push the bounds of what's possible, you know, within their weight class. I feel like a big part of that is that, you know, we know specificity wise what reps are going to drive the most progress and have the most bang for their buck per rep. And that's going to be training at higher intensities at lower, you know, bar velocities that are most specific to 1 rep max strength. And I think that there's kind of been a shift from like, okay, let's see how many of these like big reps we could fit into our bucket to, all right, maybe we could fit this many, but if we like tone it down 30, 40% and then fill the bucket up with like a little bit more of these little reps that we, you know, maybe only got 20% of our training from, now we get 50% of our training from it, and stack that up over time, I feel like cumulatively that has led to the increases in strength that we've seen, is just kind of like an appreciation for not necessarily having to hit home runs all the time and just, you know, getting all these little singles and doubles. And
I mean, that's a totally valid way to win, right? Yeah. I mean, that's a change that I've seen since the, I don't know, I would say 2015 era. I think you're in large part responsible for that shift too, away from hyper specificity. I would characterize like the 2015 era as being like very hyper specific. If it wasn't a comp lift, squat, bench, or deadlift, then do you really need to be doing this at all? You know, and it was just very comp lift focused. And you could loop in other things, but it was only in very specific instances and things like that. That's my interpretation of like the dominant training paradigm at the time. And it seems like we've shifted away from that to still including a lot of specificity, but paying attention to transfer, paying attention to things like a lot of what I hear you saying could be filed under like stimulus to fatigue ratio. That some things have a tendency to beat people up a lot. Well, you could do that, or you could do something else that's slightly less ROI and just not get so beat up. And then you can do more of it, and then you can perform better on your comp day. Do you feel like that's even like going down to like the weekly schedule? Do you feel like finding a weekly schedule to like really optimize performance or really highlight performance on, say, primary days, is that something that you would say is a big focus for your coaching early on?
What I would say with regards to like really kind of putting all your eggs in one basket to like a primary or a secondary day, like I always make a point whenever I get Q&As about stuff like this, where people are really like, oh, like, they just use those terms and clearly have like very, very strict different definitions for things. I try to make the point that like, yes, sometimes certain lifters do require massive, load management strategies that will, put all of the exertion almost on one day and then everything else is kind of mindless. But like, that's not the majority of people, number one. Number two, I think that a lot of times what dictates whether or not something is, primary, secondary, tertiary, are the acute fatigue patterns themselves, and not necessarily trying to just like nerf one day and make it negligible and then make one other day spectacular. It's like, if you're 30 pounds weaker on a given day, like that's your secondary, right? Like that's what made it that day, is that your performance is not as high on that day. And should we avoid, redlining and overshooting and negatively impacting your primary day through emotionally charged weight loading or whatever? Sure, absolutely. But that doesn't, for most lifters, especially the types who ask me these questions, it's like, that should not be the focus. So, no, I'm not trying to, that drastically, I guess put all the eggs in one basket. With regards to like predictability of performance, if we're talking about like lining up certain days with the days of the week that you compete, like, sure, if a lifter shows, I guess like fickleness would be a way that I'd word it. So like, if I could give you the most extreme example, like if someone benched, 5 or 6 days a week, like I do, where the trends are going to be very robust, where it's like, this day always sucks, this day is always good. And trying to change that when you're benching every day is much more difficult than if you're, deadlifting on a Tuesday and you compete on a Saturday, right? Like that retention rate is much longer with something like that. Does it really matter? Probably not, right? So if someone has shown either through, their past training history or just like what their frequency and total workload demands are, that it's not that important to actually try to line things up so perfectly in that regard, then it's not necessary, right? I don't think that should be a path that takes up so much of your mental energy that you end up kind of putting them in a worse training scenario overall, in terms of what you can extract from that training period altogether, just for the sake of having one day feel better than another. Like, I don't know how worth it something like that is.
That makes sense. Do you find yourself programming a lot of SBD days? Probably not then.
I do, for lifters who it logistically makes sense for. Like if you are squatting, 3 days a week, let's say, and you are a pretty strong deadlifter, like I know a lot of people who are going to have interference, by deadlifting the day after a squat day. Some people, and that's the thing, is like, I'm not a stranger to changing stuff like that. Like I have some heavier lifters who maybe just don't have the endurance to make it through an SBD day. They're like, I got to deadlifts and I was smoked. I couldn't do it. And then someone like me, I feel like just like physically, I could probably do like 2 SB, like I could do SBD in a day. And physically, as long as I have something to drink and eat, like I'll feel fine. Right. So like, if that's how I feel, and if I were to do squats and then the next day feel destroyed, I'm not going to deadlift the day after. I would rather just get it all done in one day if I have the endurance and the mental perception that I can do it, to do it all in one day. But again, there are lifters where, either whether it's coming from their psychology or physiology that they can't get both done in one day, then I'm not going to force them to do that. Right. I don't think that, like some people will say like, oh, there's the specificity aspect to doing an SBD day to, a competition. And I guess in rare cases, maybe that's worth doing. But I feel like with just the way that programming has gone, like on a lower body day, I feel like you're doing enough work regardless that if you can handle making it through that day, you can handle doing 9 lifts on a competition day. Maybe if they're, like I said, if they're like, I'd heavier lifters who maybe, they only have singles on deadlift on their secondary day. And it's like, yeah, maybe if squat causes too much interference to pull the next day, and meet day, sometimes they feel gassed. It's like, yeah, we'll put that on the same day for the sake of getting that practice in. But I mean, it really all boils like, I think I mentioned this on the Powerlifting Now podcast. If I didn't, I apologize. So I'll bring it up again. But I'm very particular in like the days that I want people to lift. Like I never write out programs as like day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. Obviously, if someone has like their own scheduling conflicts and have more important stuff going on, then obviously, you have to make do, right? Perfect is the enemy of good. Let's just get the job done. But I'm pretty particular with how I prescribe things like that because, some people do have this, heightened fatigue response after, squatting one day where maybe the next day they're destroyed. And then there are other people who can squat and deadlift the next day just fine. Like for myself, I'll give you an example for myself. Like when I have more than like one day of rest between my 2 deadlift days, my deadlift tanks. And it's been something that I've noticed since 2018 when I was working with Joey. And, now we're 5 years past that working with Steve. And every time that we've increased the window between those days, maybe deadlifting Wednesday, Saturday versus Wednesday, Friday, everything can stay static except for the schedule, and my deadlift will tank. Right. So like I think there's something to be said about that scheduling specificity where, I just want to, I think, let me think how I want to say this. I think that if you're not like privy to something like this and you're just writing things out in a certain way and the training response is negative, then you might say, oh, well, clearly there's something wrong with the programming and we need to change something up. But if you get the feedback of like, hey, every time I'm coming into deadlift, my back is smoked or I have like a back pump, it's just, you switch the days around, you're fine.
Well, fully agree with you, by the way, that I definitely will use like flexible scheduling as a tool for people who are living in like this flux sort of situation. But even then, like I can't deny that the days that you lift and the days that you do certain things matters, and yeah, exactly. Like perfect is the enemy of the good. And if you've got somebody who works swing shift or does something like that, then yeah, you find ways to fit it in. That's better than not training, but it definitely has an effect. And like over time, I've gotten better and better at kind of helping people navigate that, I think, so if you're in a situation where you have to train, you have to stack all your 4 training days for the week right in a row, that's not ideal. But some things are probably going to need to be adjusted. And, you get through that period. You'd rather not do that all the time, though. Like it definitely the days, like the order of things, the distribution of the stress, like all that stuff definitely matters. Definitely agree with you.
Along that same vein, like, I guess the way that I've talked about it very much is in the context of like just letting fatigue dissipate, right? So like just giving yourself time to deal with whatever workload you were just exposed to. But I've also found it to be important in the case of like prior work being facilitative of better performances. So like having a higher intensity exposure placed closer to the day that's the primary day versus that day being maybe a bit further, and then that reduces like your, you know, ability to produce force or your technical proficiency on the primary day. So like having athletes who, you know, they come into their Saturday squat session and their body feels great, they feel fresh, and then it's like, I feel like I forgot how to squat, or the bar feels like 1,000,000 pounds on my back. And then it's like, you look at the program and you can say, oh, well, like you needed your, you know, your other squat exposure to be closer to your primary day, or you needed a higher intensity exposure closer to your primary day. So there have been times where like I could add, you know, a single or some sort of higher intensity exposure to the secondary, and that increases the performance on the primary, or literally bringing that schedule closer together, and that yields a better performance on the primary day. So it's interesting how it kind of works both ways, where it's like, you know, a matter of, for one athlete, giving them enough time to be adequately recovered for a session. And then for another athlete, you know, I guess the opposite of not being recovered would be, you know, or being recovered enough would be not being recovered enough, but that's not what it is, right? It's actually having them feel trained enough, I guess would be the way to word it, for that primary
There's definitely
session.
some sort of balance to strike there. For me, it's changed over the years too. Like I used to be a lifter who would, you know, do my main squatting on Monday and then main deadlifting on Tuesday. Probably more lower body accessory stuff after deadlifting on Tuesday. But in this last prep that I did, that didn't go so well. You know, it was okay, but I definitely didn't see the movement on deadlift that I wanted to. And I think a lot of it was due to that interference. We're just, again, separating things out a little bit. It's one of these things where, like, on paper, it maybe even shouldn't matter that much, you know, because you're still getting roughly the same amount of stress. You're recovering from all of it in roughly the same time period. It should more or less balance out. But it seems to be small variables can, not all small variables, but some small variables are going to have an outsized impact on whether you're going to see progress at all or not, maybe.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about technique as well. How do you, I guess, how involved are you on coaching technique for your lifters? How involved do you think, like, is there some point where it's kind of over coaching technique, or do you think that we can get really far down in the weeds here? Or, you know, what do you think is the right orientation for a coach to be at?
Yeah. Well, I think the way that, so I wasn't in attendance, but I just know because I'm good friends with these guys. But I know that Brad Couliard did the seminar at the Corrupted Summit, which was last September, kind of talking about technique, and really the main, you know, points to address for, like, you know, when should technique absolutely be addressed is like, you know, is the lifter able to lift to the comp standard? Is it leading to, you know, inconsistency in like failure of the lift? Like, do you have a low success rate because of how you're lifting, or is it not sustainable by way of getting injured? So for me, those are kind of like three of the non-negotiables, right? Like those boxes kind of have to be checked off if we're going to be more hands-off with how we're approaching the technique. Like, are you lifting to a standard that would get you, you know, white lights in competition? Are you able to complete lifts that you should be able to lift? And then, you know, are you staying healthy? From, you know, in my own coaching experience, I think this probably came from, you know, my own personal journey as an athlete of being, you know, very kind of an oddball with my technique. Like when I first started, I benched with a super close grip, no arch, close stance on squat, conventional deadlift. And then obviously as time has gone on, my squat stance has moved out. My deadlift, I pull sumo, and then bench is, arguably one of the more technical benches in powerlifting. So I think that through my own lifting experience, I've done across the spectrum for each lift. And I think that's given me a good eye for coaching technique. But like the whens and whys, right, are definitely, a delicate balance to strike. So, I guess to answer one of the reasons why I wouldn't touch technique, like I have lifters who, by all of the standards of technique gurus, are like too extended on squat, or their center of mass is a little bit shifty, or, whatever kind of like hard metrics you would decide like, hey, this is not good. I have someone who does that as a 700-pound squatter. Is that something that I really care to address if they've been, relatively healthy? No. And I think that as a coach who will say no to that, at least in my mind, that also makes me question, okay, but like, while we can't predict injury, am I potentially putting someone at, higher risk of not addressing something like this? And, I feel like I have to ask myself those questions to make sure that, I put my athlete in the best possible scenario. But I feel like we do have some proxies or some indicators along that, along the path to answering that question, which are, with lifting the way that they do, are they, unable to handle, overall workloads that they should be able to? Like, is there something about their technique that's leading to, a reduction in work capacity, or maybe disproportionate amounts of fatigue being, allocated to some sort of, structure that just shouldn't be? Like, are their hips just getting smoked after like a very manageable, or what should be deemed manageable, amount of squatting? Are they going back to the first point of, that the 3 non-negotiables? Like, are they, just like very inconsistent in their ability to actually execute? Are they missing lifts that, like, based on, previous warm-ups or any reasonable indicator that, is it just a roll of the dice every time that they go for a max? So something like that, I think it would be worth looking at. But I would say that I'm personally pretty involved with technique. And I feel like because so many lifters in recent times, especially, like, really have tried to optimize technique, I think we see a lot of bodies, especially on stuff like deadlift and bench, that have kind of leveraged their way to lifts that you maybe think that they shouldn't be capable of. So I think with that, the lifters who are maybe not lifting correctly can kind of feel more so when they're off or when they're not on the right track, because they kind of see this, what is now looked at as like the gold standard of technique for a sumo deadlift, or like a shorter range of motion bench press. But yeah, I mean, I would say that I'm pretty involved. I would definitely say that my areas of expertise in bench and deadlift have definitely come through like a lot of personal experience. And then, with regards to squat, my squat, putting it bluntly, is hideous. It's horrible to look at. It's not a good looking squat. But I feel like the squat is the lift that gets the most attention from the movement science and biomechanics guys. And I've had a lot of good mentors in that space. So when it's come to addressing issues of, pain associated with the squat, I feel like I've been really good at managing that with athletes through technique or exercise prescription, or like managing center of mass, that I just have a good eye for figuring out why someone might be having difficulty with that. It's, in terms of like responsibility of the coach and what their role is, I think that there are certainly, like athletes you can look at where you can tell that they're not lifting to the, with a technique that is going to be long-term, like optimal or sustainable. And I feel like it's probably every coach's job to get them out of whatever like terrible form that is, if it's not yielding success. But Lose my train of thought here. I'll come back to it in a
That's good.
second.
I think that well, I'm
No, okay. I remember now. The one thing that I will say is that, when it comes to the role of the coach with technique, I think that expectations amongst the athlete and the coach are important to establish. When I worked with Joey, we had a mutual agreement that like I was both tinkering with my own technique kind of individually and had my own neuroticism regarding that. And then also had other, resources or people that I could talk to that were very helpful with that. And it was just not something that I felt like I really needed too much of a pair of eyes from Joey in that regard. But obviously if you're someone who feels like the biggest obstacle to your progress is that technical mastery, then obviously you would want someone who can who can fill that role for you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I'm largely in agreement with everything you said. I think that looking at it primarily through a performance role, once those initial bases are covered, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I do think I'm not I'm not sure if there's even actually a term for it, but I'm not the kind of person that thinks that technique is, irrelevant to injury. Despite data being what data is, I just don't think that's fully correct. I think that what you see in like athletic populations in particular is, pushing as hard as you can. Like you're pushing a body to its limits in terms of workload. Already you're pushing as much workload as the person can tolerate, and just from a mechanical system standpoint, things are going to break down in predictable ways when you push them to a limit. Now, bodies can adapt, and vulnerable tissue can be reinforced and become not so vulnerable anymore. But even then, there's a limit to where that is. And I mean, I think you see it too in like injury patterns, that powerlifters get injured in different ways than baseball players, or even weightlifters. It's the demands of the sport are different, and so the injury patterns are different. And I think those things are pretty inextricable. But I mean, with that said, I don't really find that to be. I think it's an important like philosophical point to make, but when it comes to coaching practice, I'm not often in a position where I'm telling somebody we need to change something because of the injury risk profile of their chosen technique. Usually, there's other things that I would manage first. Like the best case that I can think of is like round back deadlifting. I do think that it probably puts more load through the spine, and that we know that back injuries tend to be common among powerlifters. So are you assuming more risk? Probably, versus, other styles, like when taken to their limits of like their tolerable limits of volume. Like it's not a guarantee of injury or anything like that. But, if you have a system that stresses certain tissues, if something is going to break down, you can probably be somewhat predictable about where that system is going to break down. But again, like we don't need to obsess over it or make it into like a huge deal. And I realize that some people are kind of unable to control that, which snowballs the conversation in a whole different direction on like, to what benefit is it to even have a conversation to begin with. But I think it's important. Like it's an important philosophical stake to make from a coach's perspective. Anyway, that's a big ramble in God knows what direction. But,
No, I mean, I definitely agree with you. One of the ways that I think, because like, you do have this massive camp within strength training that really wants to belabor the point of, technique does not predict injury. And, I do think that we know if you've exposed yourself to a movement pattern sufficient number of times, and you've built the tissue tolerance, and your muscles have developed in a certain way, and your nervous system has, become comfortable with the pattern, eventually, if, over time, that's probably going to be a more sustainable pattern, right? Like the quote goes, you're only, at risk, I'm paraphrasing, but like, it's only a dangerous movement if your body's not prepared for it. But I mean, the way that I think about it is, you have a cumulative amount of stress that eventually leads to some sort of structure failing. And that equation is solved by, the stress per unit exposure, right? Like every time you expose yourself to a movement, how much stress a certain area is accumulated, multiplied by the number of exposures in some sort of time frame, right? And, if you reach that tolerance, I think that we can say that, or we can ask the question of like, why is the stress per unit exposure so high? Right? Like, why do you reach that at a certain point, whereas a different athlete or lifting with a different technique wouldn't bring you to that point? But yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement. I'm not, focusing too heavily on, oh, well, people who lift like this are more likely to get injured. It's like, you got to look at the other pieces, right? It's, are you lifting in this way that could predict more injury, and also not able to handle a lot of workload, and also not recovering, and also failing your lifts? Like, it's just, if the formula is a failure, then yes, it's kind of worth, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But if we have successful, sustainable, I mean, that's, really all that we can ask for. That's the one thing that we're not, guaranteed. And if we can hold on to that, then we're in a great spot.
I think too, like once you cover those bases, a lot of technique kind of moves internal anyway. I'm sure you've had this experience before where something feels off, like in a very specific way, like you know what you did, but you go back and look at the video and it's not visible on video, that oh, my elbow was off, or I had my, when I started to come up from the bottom, I pitched forward or whatever. Then you look at the video and it's like, yeah, it looked fine. I tend to think that pretty early on, it's not like it takes decades to get to this point, but you get to a point where you'll perceive technical errors before they're visible, and thus you'll need to be able to correct them without outside observation, without video review and things. Like video review is helpful, but I'm not going to be able to tell, oh, I just wasn't very active with my feet. Like, you're not going to be able to see that in a video review.
Yeah.
So,
no,
I like to kind of push technique in that direction. I mean, it's a thing where, again, like you said earlier, like you've got to be on the same page with the athlete in terms of expectations and everything for that to work. But if it's possible, I want to push technique in that direction so that, they can start to feel it, and because they're going to have to feel it eventually anyway. Like when you're on the platform, it's just you up there. And then, we can kind of guide in that direction. I think it gives you some options. Like you can change things too, possibly within a single attempt, but definitely from one attempt to the next. If something isn't right, you can make a correction for it. If you descend a little bit too vertically, or you're slightly out of position when you get to the bottom of your squat, then you know how it all works in a, maybe not in a like a verbal kind of way, but you know what the feelings that you have to generate are, you know what the internal perceptions are, and so you just can do it. It expresses itself through like movement competency and not necessarily like the words around it. So I definitely like to push that stuff down toward the athlete as much as we can, so they can feel it and like hopefully like really build a robust form of technical mastery. Well, man, I think that's a good amount of your time that I've taken up today. I appreciate.
Oh, you can take up all the time you want, Mike. I appreciate you.
Thanks for hanging out. I like comparing notes with you a little bit. I mean, we're in a pretty cool spot, I think, where we agree on a lot of the basics and see a few things differently, but it makes for really interesting conversation. Got a lot of respect for what you're doing, and
that means a lot. Thank you.
Been wanting to do a podcast with you for a long time, so I'm glad we finally. Well, I guess this is the second one technically, but I'm glad we finally did one over here too.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. No, absolutely. I'll have to have you on my podcast at some point then, because we have one. Our team has one running as well. So I
definitely
appreciate
good
it, man.
stuff, man. All right, thanks again. Thanks everybody for watching and listening, and we'll see you guys next time.